One of the most harrowing execution methods used throughout history was crucifixion, in which someone was nailed to a cross or a building and then left to succumb to their ordeal, being exposed to the elements. Of course, this is one of the biggest symbols across the world and was the fate of Jesus Christ at the hands of the Romans, but crucifixion has been said to have been one of the worst and most barbaric execution methods of them all. But surprisingly, it was even used during the Second World War on a number of occasions, as something which was popularised and was considered ancient and medieval-style punishment was brought back onto the battlefields of the deadliest conflict in human history. But some guards of the concentration camps even crucified prisoners upside down to send a barbaric message to other inmates to fall into line and to not disobey the camp's rules. Welcome to the Fortress. Join us today as we look at crucifixion, World War II's most brutal execution method. And as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. During the First World War, there was an account that travelled around the trenches of a soldier being crucified. As mentioned, this execution method involved someone being nailed to a structure or a cross or some form of building. The story of a Canadian soldier being crucified by the German army has been debated, but it emerged around the year 1915, and this was then investigated. It was claimed that German soldiers had crucified a Canadian soldier who had bayonets thrust through his hands and feet, and that he had also been riddled with bullets and a bayonet was then driven through his throat. Further eyewitnesses corroborated this, saying they saw the corpse of a Canadian soldier fastened to a barn door with bayonets, but the authenticity of this claim has been questioned, and it has even been investigated that this could have been the fate of one man, Harry Banks, of the Central Ontario Regiment, and evidence was found linking him to this. But crucifixion was thought to have been an execution method of the early medieval period, but it was used during the Second World War on a number of occasions. One of the most infamous uses of the execution method inside of the conflict saw two priests who had been imprisoned inside of Buchenwald Concentration Camp subjected to this. Otto Neururer was a priest who was sent to Dachau concentration camp first, before he was then sent on to Buchenwald. He was imprisoned by the Nazis for attempting to persuade a girl not to marry a man who had been previously divorced, but Neururer was then locked up himself. He was said to have been sentenced on a charge of slander to detriment of German marriage, and whilst he was inside of Buchenwald, he was subjected to brutal and ruthless treatment. He arrived at Buchenwald on the 26th of September 1939, and he throughout his imprisonment was beaten brutally and tortured, and he was also locked up and was given very small food rations, and he lost a huge amount of weight. He even gave much of his food to others who were suffering more than him. But Neururer was trapped, and he then agreed to perform a banned baptism ceremony within the Buchenwald camp, and this of course was against the camp rules, and this resulted in him being sent to the punishment block. He was tortured ruthlessly by a brutal guard named Martin Sommer, who gained the nickname the Hangman of Buchenwald. Sommer had a huge hatred of Catholic priests, and they often were treated the worst by him. There was another priest who found himself locked up too, along with many others, and this specifically was Matthäus Spanlang. The pair were condemned to death. They were then taken into the forests of Buchenwald, next to the main sites by Martin Sommer, who then crucified the pair upside down on a tree. Neururer should have screamed and wailed in pain, but he never allegedly complained and accepted his fate, and he spoke to God in his final moments. But it took a harrowing 34 hours straight for the crucified Otto Neururer to be killed by his ordeal, and Spanlang succumbed to his ordeal hours before. Their death certificates claimed that the pair both died of acute cardiac weakness, which was usually a lie to say that the prisoners were actually executed by guards at the camp. The treatment of Neururer and Spanlang showed the brutality of Martin Sommer, but also the fact that the Nazis utilised crucifixion, and there may have been some religious elements to this execution method, with the brutal guard mocking their religion and their standing within the Catholic Church, as we know that Sommer hated Catholic priests. But even in the Pacific theatre, across the globe during the conflict, crucifixion was used upon Allied prisoners of war. Herbert James Edwards, also known as Ringer Edwards, fell into the hands of the Japanese enemy, and he was forced to work on what was known as a Burmese railway. He was part of the forced labour groups held in absolutely terrible conditions, and the Japanese guards were known for carrying out torture and execution upon the prisoners of war if they did not work hard enough, and they were constantly kept in states of starvation and suffering. They had to deal with the violence of the guards as well. Ringer Edwards found himself so desperate that he, along with 2 other prisoners, killed cattle to obtain food for themselves and also their fellow soldiers who were suffering. But when they did this, the Japanese actually caught them red-handed, and they then, because of how serious this offence was, sentenced them to death. It was thought that the men would be shot in a military style, or would then be hanged by the Japanese, presumably from a tree or some form of gallows. However, they went further and chose to use crucifixion as a method to execute not just 1 man, but 3. The men were all bound by the wrists with fencing wire. They were then crucified on the trees, and they were then assaulted by the Japanese forces, who beat them and battered them with weapons such as a baseball bat. But Ringer Edwards at some point managed to somehow free his right hand, and the wire had been driven through the palms of his hand, almost like a nail would on the cross. But seeing his plight being crucified to a tree, a number of fellow prisoners of war who knew him risked their own lives, and they smuggled Ringer Edwards food, and because of this he did manage to survive his execution ordeal. But he would be then cut down 63 harrowing hours later, with the Japanese considering that this was enough punishment for him, and they could not really work out how he had survived. Ringer Edwards even managed to survive the Second World War, and he died in the year 2000. So crucifixion, although mostly associated with the death of Jesus Christ, was an execution method which, despite having a very, very long history, was used upon many prisoners and suffering people during the Second World War, and it was a harrowing ordeal for them. It was considered, and still is, one of the most serious execution methods of them all, and many of the cases of it during the war were not ordered by the authorities, such as the SS, but they were actually inflicted upon prisoners by guards who decided to do this and then decided their fate. The sadists that carried out the crucifixions included some of the most barbaric guards of the conflict, and it was an execution method which has been said to be one of the worst. However, the guards chose to do this themselves. They were not authorised to do it, but they went ahead inflicting crucifixion onto many suffering people. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.